Welcome to the World Today on Channels Television. I am Amarachi Obani. So here's the program today. President Barack Obama is very pleased with the combined efforts that attacked ISIS in Syria overnight. It's a move that he says makes it clear to the world that ISIS is not America's fight alone and that the governments in the Middle East are rejecting ISIS. It's the first collaborative attack on the militants in Syria. A Pentagon spokesperson, Rear Admiral John Kirby, said fighter and bomber jets and Tomahawk missiles were used in the campaign against the militants much earlier today. Those strikes are part of President Barack Obama's pledge to, quote, degrade and destroy ISIS, which has taken huge swathes of land in Syria and in Iraq, where they're presently occupying. While the U.S. has already launched about 190 airstrikes in Iraq since August, the Syrian government says it has not formally consented to the airstrikes on its territory, but it was indeed informed before the airstrikes took place. And let's join the VOA's Elizabeth Arrett, who is in the newsroom in Washington, for more on this. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on The World Today. Strikes that happened between yesterday and today were by Arab countries, not particularly the West, right? Because I do understand that Britain did not take part in the airstrikes.
That's right. The Pentagon said that it was 5 Arab countries that took part along with the U.S., 4 of them actively: Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. Qatar did not take part, but offered some support. So this was something that it was very surprising how quickly he was able to get this coalition together and actually be militarily involved. And that's from going just 2 weeks ago under criticism before he gave his speech talking about going after, possibly in Syria, to getting this launched really with this cooperation and level of coordination, I think has taken some people quite by surprise.
It's quite interesting, too, that Syria seems to be on board with this airstrikes, the fact that they're actually taking place in their own territory, considering the relationship between Syria and the United States.
Yes, the government in Syria made clear that it didn't give permission for the strikes, but they certainly didn't block it. We heard from the Pentagon today that they had put their quite robust radar system and anti-aircraft system on a passive mode, which they had been, as we heard, as you had said, that they had been informed that these were going to take place and obviously stood down some of their defensive capabilities to allow it to go forward.
So what's the way forward now? I mean, what's the plan of action that you've heard and you've observed, maybe from the Pentagon or probably from the U.S. government? What's the next step now?
Well, the Pentagon made clear this is only the beginning. They're saying it's the beginning of a sustained and lasting multi-pronged attack that's going to go on possibly for years. They said don't think about it in terms of months, think of it in terms of years. Now, they will probably have to have ground troops. Airstrikes are only effective to a certain point. And their plan of action, at least at this point, is to try and get the Peshmerga in Iraqi Kurdistan, the Iraqi government forces, to be those ground troops, possibly other regional allies, it's not clear yet, but use these airstrikes to give them time to regroup against the Islamic State advances in Iraq, by hitting them in their bases in Syria. Give them time to stand up and then go after those kind of sources.
And it's really interesting, Elizabeth, because there are more than just one terrorist organization in Syria. Don't forget that there's a group fighting against the government. There's also a different group that's fighting with ISIS. There's also a different group fighting with ISIS in Iraq. In the end, Syria and Iran are not participating or did not participate in the talks that held last week in Paris and did not make any pledges concerning fighting ISIS. But how does the U.S. and how does Syria and the other Arab countries hope to manage the other terrorist groups in Syria and in Iraq, perhaps?
Well, that's a very good question. One of the things, and you mentioned the other groups, and I think also was kind of a surprise today, was how they went after Khorasan, which is the al-Qaeda-affiliated group that really is set up in the last year. And President Obama and the Pentagon spoke about what they said was an imminent threat from them. Again, they were talking against U.S. or Western targets. These are Al-Qaeda-linked fighters that came originally from Pakistan, and very specialists in bomb making. And they said that they were just about to go into the operational phase. Now, that's something I think a lot of people would support, including, the Assad government and Iran, that they would to go against these kind of counter-terrorist measures. Of course, there's also the concern, and has been voiced, that by going after the enemies of Assad, that they're somehow helping Assad stay in power, which is against what the U.S. has said it wants to do. The Pentagon replied that they have to tackle the problem of the Islamic State, and they didn't want to address anything beyond that at this point.
No, thanks a lot, Elizabeth. Your insights have been very helpful. We'll know you keep eyes on this issue for us on the ground. The VOA's Elizabeth Arrett joined us from the VOA newsroom in Washington. Well, President Barack Obama did have something to say about the attacks that happened overnight in Syria. Let's just take a listen to what the president said much earlier today.
Last night, on my orders, America's armed forces began strikes against ISIL targets in Syria. Today, the American people give thanks for the extraordinary service of our men and women in uniform, including the pilots who flew these missions with the courage and professionalism that we've come to expect from the finest military that the world's ever known. Earlier this month, I outlined for the American people our strategy to confront the threat posed by the terrorist group known as ISIL. I made clear that as part of this campaign, the United States would take action against targets in both Iraq and Syria, so that these terrorists can't find safe haven anywhere. I also made clear that America would act as part of a broad coalition, and that's exactly what we've done. We were joined in this action by our friends and partners: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Bahrain, and Qatar. America's proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with these nations on behalf of our common security. The strength of this coalition makes it clear to the world that this is not America's fight alone. Above all, the people and governments of the Middle East are rejecting ISIL and standing up for the peace and security that the people of the region and the world deserve.